South Africa contends that Israel has transgressed by committing actions that fall within the definition of genocide.
The applicant has regrettably put before the court a profoundly distorted factual and legal picture. The entirety of its case hinges on a deliberately curated, decontextualized, and manipulative description of the reality of current hostilities.
Shalom everyone, and welcome to another Pod for Israel. My name is Erez Soref, and I have with me Golan Boshi. Shalom Golan.
Shalom, shalom.
And we want to talk today about the International Court of Justice in The Hague, the Netherlands, and the court case that South Africa has against Israel, with no less the charge in this court, in this trial, is that Israel is doing a genocide in Gaza. So I watched some of the things that have been going on there, Golan, and I got to tell you, I was completely shocked.
Yeah, the persecution, I think, is from South Africa. And, you know, we're always surprised to see after the 7th of October, we're always surprised that the treatment of Israel is getting from bad to worse. And we're always surprised to the worst. It goes on and on. It doesn't stop.
And you know, I was listening also to some of the arguments of the plaintiffs in Hague against Israel, and I mean, I was completely shocked, because if you believe what they say, Israel is to blame for all the terrible things that are going on in the world.
Yeah, so not only in Gaza, we can blame Israel for everything that goes bad in the world. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think that South Africa, of all countries, is the one persecuting Israel in the Netherlands, in Hague?
Yeah, and you know, I think that's a question that a lot of people ask themselves. I think it may have to do with the fact that previous governments of Israel in previous decades had a good relationship with South Africa, again, in previous decades. And so the new regime, wanting to show that they clean their hands off of what used to happen there before, and one of the ways they want to do it is stand against Israel.
It's like a sweet revenge.
Yeah, exactly, like a revenge.
But as much as this trial against Israel in the Netherlands is twisted and wrong, I think that it expresses like a microcosmos of the way the world treats Israel in general, not only in this case in Hague, but in general. And it always reminds me, a philosopher that I can't remember his name, but a philosopher that once said that the nation that gave the world Jesus became the Jesus of the world.
Right. And I think that echoes, just as you're saying, I think that echoes Augustine from the 4th century, and he said, you know, he had the eternal witness doctrine.
Yeah, what scholars are calling the doctrine of eternal witness. And according to Augustine,
tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so according to Augustine, the survival of the Jews and the fact that they're scattered, that was of course before the modern state of Israel, the fact that the Jews are scattered all around the world is the punishment for rejecting Yeshua, rejecting Jesus. And for Augustinus, Israel was the witness to their rejection of God. So that's their punishment, and they're doomed to be rejected forever. So according to Augustine, the church should always keep Israel alive, but keep him humble.
Subdue the Jews.
Exactly. So they would always, the Jews will remember their rejection, and the world will see the witness. This is what happens to those who reject Yeshua, to those who reject Jesus.
So that doesn't really sound like causing the Jewish people to jealousy. That sounds like subduing the Jewish people by mainly the Catholic Church, right?
Of course. I wish, that's why we always say the so-called church, because we know that there's really lovers of Israel, lovers of God, and they don't represent the atrocities of the church in the past.
So as we know, throughout church history, unfortunately, there have been some parts where, as you said, so-called Christians have persecuted the Jewish people, behaved exactly the opposite to what God has said to do. But, we live in a day and an age that after the Holocaust, after the establishment of the State of Israel, in many cases, the relation of nations and of people to Israel has changed for the better. And I think also many Christians have changed their attitude and re-examined their theological views, because there was a state of Israel. The Jews are being gathered. Now, however, I can't escape the feeling that in the last few years, and particularly the last several months, there's this huge regression to the atrocities of the past.
So you mentioned the Holocaust, and I think that now surveys are showing that the level of anti-Semitism is even higher than it was in Germany before the Holocaust. And that reminds me an article that a really famous rabbi, that he hated the so-called Christianity. He never knew Yeshua. He never knew Jesus, but he hated the representative of Jesus in history. And he wrote an article, and the article is called The Witness. Now, he took the witness doctrine of Augustine, and of course he wrote it in Hebrew, but what he says, he referred to Isaiah 53. Mm-hmm. So that Isaiah 53, the rabbis see the suffering servant as Israel, as the nation of Israel.
Right.
And what Rabbi Eliezer Berkovich, in the article that he called The Witness, he says Israel is called to be the witness. Israel is the suffering servant. And he says the absurd is that Christianity, which says that the suffering servant is Jesus, Christianity made the interpretation of the rabbis be true.
To seem correct.
Yeah, because the church made Israel to be the suffering servant of this world. So it's an absurd, this rabbi says, that the church, which claims Yeshua fulfilled Isaiah 53, and of course he did, the church made Israel be the suffering servant all through history.
So there's two things that I want to say here, just to clarify for our listeners and those that are watching us. So first of all, I think what Rabbi Berkowitz, who didn't know the Messiah, what he said, he looked at the terrible history of particularly the Catholic Church and the Jewish people, and he said, well, there you go, you completely twisted it, and you prove our interpretation.
And he wrote it after the Holocaust.
Now, I think that is illustrative to the way many Jewish people see even terrible things like the Holocaust. The Holocaust was caused, that's the first reaction a lot of Jews would say, by Christians, which, it's so sad. Now, the second thing, and that's important you mentioned the rabbinic interpretation of Isaiah 53, and I think a word of explanation here would be in place. So the most famous Jewish interpreter of all times, now is an absolute genius, and in his day, his name is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, or for short, Rashi.
Yeah.
And so he lived in the 11th century in France, mainly, and he was an absolute genius.
Yeah, and he wanted to protect his Jewish community.
Exactly. Well, in his days, there was, debates between the Catholic Church and the Jewish community. And so to defend the rabbinic interpretation, he wrote a lot about basically the entire Hebrew Bible, but specifically about Isaiah 53. And he said the suffering servant is actually not a person, it's a nation. And no less, it's the nation of Israel. So Golan, tell us first, why did he say that? Is there any merit in the argument that the suffering servant is a nation, the nation of Israel, and not a person?
Yes, so he says that in Isaiah 53, the nations, the Gentiles are speaking, and Israel is suffering for their benefit. Now, as you said, it's true that in some chapters in Isaiah from 41, in some chapters, the suffering servant is Israel.
The servant, not the suffering servant.
Excuse me, the servant, right. The servant of God is Israel.
That's
is referred to Jacob and Israel.
Right.
But
however,
in chapter 52 and then 53, it changes to be an individual.
Right.
And now I want the audience to think about it. What Rashi is saying could have really horrible applications, because he says the Gentiles are saying, the Gentile are referring to the suffering servant in Isaiah 53, and it implies that he suffers, Israel suffers, and by the suffering that the Gentile are causing Israel, they would be forgiven.
They're blessed, right? Forgiven, blessed, so on.
So Rashi almost encourages anti-Semitic, God forbid, because the Gentiles are causing suffering, and by the suffering of Israel, the Gentiles are being forgiven. And this is exactly the opposite of what Isaiah is saying. And I want you maybe to read it in English. It's Isaiah 41, and it's verses 8 to 11. So
let's read it.
Yes, so Isaiah 41, 8 to 11. And these verses prove that God is saying, if you hurt Israel, you're not going to be forgiven. You're going to be destroyed. And that's really important. Isaiah 41, from 8 to 11.
But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend or beloved, you whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from the farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not cast you off. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Behold, all who are incensed against you shall be put to shame and confounded. Those who strive against you shall be as nothing and shall perish.
So Isaiah is saying those who will hurt Israel will perish. Exactly the opposite of what Rashi and the rabbis are saying about Isaiah 53. It means Isaiah 53 cannot be, the suffering servant cannot be Israel. Because obviously if you hurt Israel, God is saying, you hurt Israel, I'm going to come after you. I'm going to eliminate you.
You know, and that's super interesting because I think that, that reminds me of the Abrahamic blessing and covenant. And God says, this is one of the first unconditional promises of God in the entire Bible. Those that bless you, I will bless. Those that curse you, I will curse. And that's reiterated throughout the Bible.
Yeah.
And so I think that echoes that.
And I just to drill the point that Isaiah 53 is talking about a suffering servant that justifies his people in the entire world, the Jewish, he justifies he sacrificed for the sins of Israel. I want you to read, if you can, in English, Isaiah 53, verses 11 and 12. So the last two verses of the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, and it makes obvious that the suffering servant suffers for his people and for everybody who will put his trust in him.
So Isaiah 53, 11 and 12. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors.
Exactly.
Amazing verses.
Exactly, and that's why, although I can identify with Eliezer Berkovich, this
with
rabbi,
the sentiment of the suffering
of
he
course,
saw. Yeah.
But Rashi's interpretation of Isaiah 53, of course, is wrong. And of course he wrote it after the Holocaust.
But
he was upset.
I would even say about Rashi, the greatest Jewish interpreter. A genius, no question. The man was a genius. He knew Hebrew, Aramaic. The guy was an absolute genius. That's what he did. In my humble opinion, he knew full well that his interpretation of Isaiah 53 is apologetic and cannot be true, both for the context and the syntax of the Hebrew in Isaiah 53.
Yeah. And again, we have to say the irony is, and that's what Berkovich is saying, this rabbi, the irony is that the
nation, so to speak, justify the rabbinic interpretation.
And Berkovich is angry because he said the irony is that the church made the rabbinic interpretation throughout history, throughout her treatment of Israel. The church made Israel to be so-called the suffering servant. So that's the irony, that's the absurd. The so-called church, because of persecution and the world, made Israel become the so-called suffering servant with that treatment, with anti-Semitism and pogroms and the Holocaust and everything else.
You know what's interesting? We see actually throughout the Bible, you see that in the book of Zechariah, and you see that also in the New Testament, particularly Matthew 25. There is a part of God's judgment that would be national. Now, I don't fully understand how that's going to work, but I think it's clear when we read Matthew 25, and Jesus is saying, well, he's going to judge the nations, I'm using my own words here, in accordance to how they treated the nation of Israel.
Amen.
And, I think that's kind of shows how Yeshua, Jesus, feels about the nation of Israel. But a question, I hear that from friends sometimes, Golan, and people that are followers of Jesus, and they say, well, you know what? The nation of Israel had a role until the first coming of the Messiah. Because, the Davidic line, Judah, the tribe of Judah, and then the Davidic line, and so on and so on. And so Yeshua was born, Jesus was born. But he already died and he rose again. So why are the Jews needed anymore now? I mean, they've finished their job. The Jewish people failed to accept Christ on his first coming, and therefore God is done with them.
And not only that, we still, we're Messianic Jews. We're a small minority in Israel. Most of our even relatives still reject. So if they rejected God, why didn't God reject them? And this is where grace is coming. And of course, the promise that God gave Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's the promise that he made to the fathers. And grace is given to somebody that is not
deserving.
Exactly. If Israel deserved it, there would be no grace.
It would be merit.
Exactly. And so it's a choice of God by grace.
I would even say, much like the nation of Israel had a part in the Messiah's first coming, those of us that actually believe that he's going to physically come to this earth and rule the world in righteousness and justice from Jerusalem, we believe he's going to physically come a second time.
Amen, amen.
And God's gathering of the Jewish people to the nation of Israel now at this time is a preparation for the Messiah's second coming. That's another purpose, so to speak, of the nation of Israel.
I think with all that Israel is going through now, I think that Yeshua is still, agonizing with his people. And I think did you tell me about this famous artist, the famous Israeli painter, that he had a unique way to portray the way that Yeshua is identifying, even though I don't think he was a believer.
No, he wasn't.
But the way that Yeshua identifies with his people, even on the cross.
Yes. So Marc Chagall, a famous artist and painter, he painted a very famous, and we can see it on the screen, a very famous painting of Yeshua, Jesus, crying out to the nations while he identifies with the nation of Israel. That was in response to the Holocaust. And I think he, in a very, as artists do, in a very emotional way, caught the connection between Yeshua, Jesus, and the Jewish people. And we talked about it in the previous podcast, how more Jewish people, Israeli people, claim Jesus as our own, so to speak, in our day and age.
Exactly. So, even we talked about this trial in Hague in the Netherlands against Israel, and it's just another symptom of the wave of anti-Semitism. But on the other hand, God always, the light shines in the darkness, and God does wonderful things. And, the challenge for our brothers and sisters all around the world, just keep standing for truth, right? Keep supporting Israel, even though it's a minority, you look like it's a minority report,
Well, I think we see in the scriptures that many, many, many times, actually most of the times, it was only a minority that stood on the right side. Amen. Thank you, Golan. And for you, our listeners, we ask you to continue to pray for the nation of Israel. We continue to encourage you to stand with the truth of the scriptures, and pray with us for the return of the Messiah to this earth and for the salvation of Israel. Thank you, and may God bless you. Shalom.